you logged into our YouTube or are you? Yeah, it's showing. It's on here live. I'm here. I want to see if I have sound. Okay, we need to turn. Test sound. Test sound. Check 1 2. Check 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 check. Test sound. Test sound. Check 1 2. Check 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 check. Perfect. Okay, we should be live on YouTube. We get the wide view on us for now, and we'll start. Go ahead and pull your mic in closer to you. Live on YouTube.
Okay.
We get the wide view on us for now. Oh. We'll start. Go ahead and pull your mic in closer to you.
Okay.
Where's that at? There we go. Okay. So we're not hearing ourselves talk.
It sounded good though.
Yeah,
Sounded good.
It did sound good. We got our sound kind of figured out last time on YouTube. You guys couldn't hear us, so hopefully this time it's a little different story. Let's get these mics adjusted correctly, and away we go. So Pete, you just got back from a nice little family vacation.
Did.
Sounded like a workcation or an outside or a manual labor workation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I went down and visited my sister and her kids, brother-in-law down in Central California. Got to see 3 minor league baseball games, the Modesto Nuts, which used to be the Modesto A's, and then the Stockton Ports. That Stockton Stadium, for anyone in Pasco listening, especially anyone that sits on city council with me, which I know probably isn't listening, or involved in the stadium, dude, that Stockton Stadium's gorgeous. I mean, it's how it's low single A ball baffles me. I mean, it's nicer than our stadium. Not that our stadium's not nice, but it's even nicer.
What kind of stuff does it have? Facilities or
for example, it's got grass built into the outside of the outfield wall, right? Like obviously there's grass in the outfield, but there's like a home run hill, right? And one of the main distinguishing features is it is built right on the water, so there's the ambiance. But for example, when you go to the Dust Devil stadiums, the visiting side is all bleachers. Those were all seats. There was also some seating where I think it's cool that we have the bullpens right there on left and right field, but their bullpen was so there was a nice padded fence like in the pros, and then there was a bullpen behind that. You could walk down to right above the bullpen. There was like a cabana area out in right field. I mean, they're all nice. This one was just kind of cool.
Yeah.
And Max, for anyone that doesn't know me, Max is my little guy. He's almost 5. He loves mascots. And so I've got some videos of him. He actually, the Ports mascot Splash sat down in a seat like 2 rows behind us, and he sat there and he's just like looking right at him, staring at him. I got a video of him in right field where Splash was lined up watching the game, and Max is just like buddied up next to him and, you know, peeking over at him. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of good stuff. Got a lot of work done while I was on vacation. We filed the Turner versus Washington Medical Commission case. You know, that's an exciting thing. You know, work doesn't stop.
Right. No, it doesn't, and it was busy for us up here, and had some issues going here personally. So I wish I was on vacation while all that happened, but hey, it is what it is. But we've got a lot that's happened over the last few weeks, and there's some things that are in the news currently. So making so much of a splash, really, that even mainstream media can't ignore these types of things, the conservative news that everybody wants to hear from our perspective. Namely, Sound of Freedom came out July 4th. And I know you haven't seen it, and you plan on taking your wife and going and seeing it. But I think it's real relevant to the fight that we're in, right? I watched a number of interviews with Tim Ballard, who's the main character, or the movie was based on true events that of his mission. He's had some really good interviews, and he talks about the fight that's, internationally. There's the sex trafficking, but the biggest consumer of what's going on with these children is actually here in the United States. And it's even the day-to-day and the legislation that's being passed in the United States that's making it even easier for these, sick people, these pedophiles, to accomplish what they are accomplishing. And he even, one of them mentioned some of the laws recently that have passed, and we talk about 5599, House Bill 5599 here in Washington passing. And I know we may have something coming down the pipeline for that. I don't know if we've been able to outline that exactly yet, but that's an issue that, it really hits home for me.
Yeah, it's something that we are working towards. I've had, one of the phone calls I had was with an organization that provides homeless housing for kids who are aged out of foster care. So primarily targeting 18 to 22-year-olds. And that's here in the state of Washington. Again, these are primary and preliminary discussions, but, talking to them about how their funding profile has been affected by 5599, it's House Bill Companion 1469, and other bad legislation because they have a Christian mission. And it's not that they deny services to these kids, but the idea is keep them segregated by gender, right? Boys, girls, and if there needs to be another house, then maybe others. Part of the issue that was identified specifically by the leadership of that organization mentioned to me that a lot of these kids in foster care, either prior to or throughout their time in foster care, had been sexually abused. And so these kids are carrying these scars, and then you put them in both physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, right? And then you put them in with kids that aren't really sure where they fit, that are maybe going through a transition, and that might be scary to that kid, who's dealing with his or her own issues. It's also scary to these kids who have been, had sexual abuse history. And so the thought is, why do anything else that could put them under the gun or under duress?
Yeah.
And I know that, quite frankly, having this open conversation, there are going to be probably people who don't follow us, but, that are going to catch wind of it and call us bigots and call us, these bad words. But the reality is we have to look at the evidence before us, and if you're looking to protect a certain class or group of people who choose to identify one way or another, or have a mental disorder and that causes them to identify outside of their, birth sex, then, it doesn't mean that the rest of the kids, or in this instance, the rest of these young adults, should have to be placed in a position where they might not feel comfortable. Again, a lot of these kids have very troubled pasts. One thing I haven't talked about much is, when I was in law school, I had the opportunity to volunteer through Big Brothers Big Sisters with one kid, and I selected to stay with one kid for those 3 years. And his name's Tali, and Tali had a very colored past. Primarily not him, but his family. His dad was in and out of jail. This kid was, I think he was 8 or 9 when I first met him. Had just bounced out of his, I think, third that year foster home, where I remember him telling me that his punishment from his foster caregiver was she'd send him to bed without food, you know, because he'd acted out at school or at home. And so he ended up in a boys' home, which was the best place for him. PJ and I subsequently talked about adopting him when we moved to California, but we felt like that was the most stable place for him, right? And, you know, Tali carried some heavy, heavy emotional scars throughout his life. And unfortunately, it looks like, as I've tried to follow him, it looks like he ended up in jail with the rest of his family. But, you know, sorry, I don't mean to dovetail into that, but, you know, what drove me to that is what was best for him was he was in a Christian home, segregated by sex, you know, where he could get in less trouble.
Right.
And my concern with these 5599s and other 1469s, these bills that have been passed, to your point, it changes the verbiage of not these particular bills, but you don't have pedophiles, you have minor attracted persons, trying to qualify it as though it's okay. You have other issues where, again, somebody's suffering from a disorder. We need to treat these kids. We don't need to make everyone else say, oh, you know, you've suffered all these other issues. You're going to sit with someone that's also struggling with something. Anyway.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I totally understand. This is part of the reason why. I mean, I kind of wrote our agenda a little bit and I led in with this topic because it does hit so close to home for us. And personally, I've shared this with you, and we actually met Tim Ballard a few years ago, just before we actually launched the foundation. And knew at that time that I had met Tim Ballard back in 2007. And for those of you who've seen Sound of Freedom, that's right around the time when he was really getting into the child sex crimes with the Department of Homeland Security there in Calexico on the U.S. Mexico border. I have a few stories from that time that maybe I'll share later on, or we'll talk about it later on. But the one that really drove it home for me with just how important his work was at the time, and then even now it's carried over into, was the last time I actually spoke with Tim Ballard when I was down there. He knew I was heading home back to Washington, and he wasn't very familiar with Washington. He's a California guy. And he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from a little town called Moses Lake in Washington. He said, oh, okay. And I said, well, why? He said, well, I'm headed up to a little town in Washington here next week. And I said, well, I know what kind of work you're in. Why are you going up to Washington, and where are you going? He said, well, I'm actually headed to a little town called Othello. It's not Moses Lake. So I said, well, that's actually only 30 minutes away from Moses Lake. And he said, yeah, there's a pedophile up there that we've been tracking and has had some pretty heinous acts up there that we're going to go and pick up. And ever since then, I realized just how personal and how close to home what that mission and what really is going on, in the the dark recesses of humanity, and why we need to bring it to light and talk about this topic and share it. And it, to that point, it's not just that level, right? It's the little things, the cracks that are being opened up to make it more and more acceptable among society, and we're really putting those that are most vulnerable, at risk. Those are children, and those children that don't maybe have parents or someone to protect them and guide them, or parents that maybe aren't, caring for them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know we're gonna talk about Jason Aldean, and admittedly, I haven't listened to the song either.
You're too busy.
Yeah.
Pop culture and what's going on in the news. That's why I'm here. I'm supposed to fill you in on what's going on.
Exactly. You're my news source. But, we have this mentality. And again, I know I've followed the story enough that I know that this isn't necessarily what's not in my small town, right? We all don't think that it's happening in my town because we're small, we're a tight-knit community. But no, man, there are outliers everywhere. And, you have to be, I hate to say it, guarded, but you have to be prepared. And, I think that's the benefit to this Sound of Freedom coming out, is that it, hopefully exposes some of us to the horrors of the world that we've, to your point, like, I'm sure if you polled 100 people, almost all of them would have said that's an issue, a third world issue.
Right.
Well, it's clearly not. and Tim and the studio that financed him and Jim Caviezel, God bless that guy for taking these, playing the role of our Savior Jesus Christ in the Passions and playing this, and he's stuck his neck out and gone very counter Hollywood to expose some of the light and dark that historically exists in this world, and he's amazing for that.
Absolutely, yeah. The when I met Tim back in 2007, he was an amazing man at the time, and I met his wife as well. And knew them as a couple, and it was really impressive at that time. And then to see what he's become, what he's built, over time, and to think that Operation Underground Railroad started around 2013. So from 2007 to 2013, and then now we're in 2023, and what he's been able to accomplish, and our small foundation, we're about to hit 2 years next month. What we've accomplished in that small amount of time. I can only hope that we can scratch the surface of what he's accomplished, but I think that our work is in a way as important for some people.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone gets to be that superhero out there protecting like our first responders, right? Not everyone's a firefighter or a police officer who goes out. In my case, our firefighters and EMTs have twice saved my kid when he's had airway collapses. Not everyone's a hero in that respect, as is Tim Ballard for literally going out there and putting himself in harm's way. I'm hoping that when our story is told, or as we tell our story, it's about people, who, one, like Tim, and again, I've not seen the movie, but reading his books, interacting with him, it's been a very faith-driven decision, right? To step out and say there's evil in the world and we have a skill set or skill sets to fight this. Ours happened to be that we knew we could communicate to people, and we knew that as a lawyer that I could bring on lawsuits, and then as we built our team with more attorneys, that we'd be able to fight for those rights, because those rights, and again, I'm going to draw back to Tim's writings. You look at the Pilgrim hypothesis, the Washington and Lincoln hypotheses. Those books are very clear, and obviously it's Tim's opinion, but I side with it, that this nation was founded on a contract or a covenant between individuals and God. And as long as we walk in that same covenant path or commitment, contractual path, that we're going to be blessed and protected. That doesn't mean that the pedophiles and these rings of bad people don't exist. Like that doesn't exist. There's no world where there's no evil. But as long as this country as a whole maintains its commitment to God, we'll be blessed and protected in great part.
Right. We jumped right over the Jason Aldean thing, but I think we made that point about try that in a small town. You need to live life, and your community, your group needs to be solid, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to not want bad things to happen or bad people to come into your community and tear it up. That's what the American dream's about, is building a community and having that with you. But to your point about the foundation of this country, another topic that's kind of going through the news cycle is we know that RFK Jr., who's admittedly a Democrat and may not align with us politically on everything, was in the House in Washington D.C. and was the hearing was about censorship, but after having been attacked and proving his point that, blatantly calling him out for lying about what he said and what he didn't say, what his closing remarks was, we need to get back to the Constitution. We need to get back to where our founding fathers intended, and that the Constitution was intended to guide this republic.
Yeah, I mean, I look at RFK Jr. and, one, his work at Children's Health Defense has been awesome. He used to be this crazy anti-vaxxer, and now I don't want to call it en vogue, but it's certainly more as the COVID-19 shots were rolled out, mandated, prescribed to no end. he's become almost prophetic in that sense, right? That he saw an issue, he fought it even when it was very unpopular. How many of us just rolled out our kids on a vaccine schedule because that's what the medical industry said?
Right.
And, he's been fighting that. So the work at Children's Health Defense, the attorneys, I've worked with one in particular, a guy named Richard Jaffe, he does great work. So, I mean, God bless that organization for doing what it's done. But to your point, here's a guy who's got Kennedy as his last name, could be doing anything, and he's out there speaking out against the man and gets kicked off of Twitter and Facebook and the other social media programs because he's willing to stand out and speak the message that we're carrying too.
Right. Well, I mean, we're feeling the censorship too. I mean, maybe the last couple of weeks we've had multiple Facebook posts that have very little or no traction, and I mean that's part of the reason why we're going live just on YouTube. We'll probably get censored here, but I think we're small enough that they're not even paying attention to us in the algorithm. But Facebook obviously has decided that we're not something that they want to promote.
No, I mean, you look at our viewer or our friends and likes, and they grew exponentially, and we're kind of at the stagnant growth. And we've got a great PR team, Katie and Ryan, thank you, who have great messages for us, both optically or visually, as well as the content. And, to your point, you get like 5 likes and 3 shares. It's like, dude, my mom probably did that instead of shares, right? Yeah. And so, back to the RFK thing. I mean, it's nuts that he goes to Washington, D.C. to tell them, and this is, mind you, this is after a court of appeals has enjoined mass organizations. I think it was Meta and Google. I'd have to look back at the case, but last week or a week and a half ago, there was a decision out of one of, I think, the 5th or the 6th Circuit that enjoined these organizations from colluding, fundamentally colluding with the U.S. government to censor people, to censor speech, to censor messaging. And so he's in this hearing in a very timely position, right? And he gets censored. And it's like, you got to be kidding here. Like, how is it that this guy comes to talk about this very topic and you are so crass or so, I don't know, just so brazen about it that you're going to censor him mid statement. So yeah, it's been interesting watching that. And, to your point, for now, we're not censored, but I expected it at a certain point. Maybe we can limp along for the next year and a quarter, and 2024, the tea leaves change.
Right. Well, and I mean, that's the reason why we have the PR team that we do. Like, once again, shout out to Katie and Ryan. They're really getting us out there onto the alternative websites, and we've got a Substack where our work is at, where you can get access to it. And we're, trying to get the Rumble going and all the other things out there. But that's really, we're having to create the alternative economy, right? That parallel economy, and get out there and create a community that is like-minded. Unfortunately, I wanted to really hit on the fact though that we are seeing that across the aisle reach out, with RFK Jr., the number of people that agree, maybe not on everything, but agree enough to understand that we need to get back to basics. We need to get back to the Constitution. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. I remember, and I think you either received the email or we talked about it or there was a phone call, and we have had several folks from King County, like Deep Blue King County, both thanking us for our work and also saying, hey man, don't call out the left because, politically that's where I'm aligned, but I love your work. Keep doing it. God bless you, right? And so to your point, it's no longer a red or blue thing. And as a nonprofit organization, we've always tried to toe that line. It just happens to be that the people we sue are Democrats, right? Jay Inslee, Bob Ferguson, the bad laws that pass through the majority of the House and the Senate here are primarily passed along party lines. That doesn't mean that the people that vote for them are necessarily bad people. I mean, again, we have a lot of supporters who are like, hey, leave the political name calling, if you will, out of it. And hey, it wasn't intentional. It's just, these are our targets, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, it's back to, as long as we can coalesce around that Constitution as the foundation of our country, And quite frankly, you know, the Bible, or in our case, you and I happen to be LDS. We have other scriptures, the Book of Mormon, that we lean on to bring us back to our relationship with God. Those are the things that will save us and unite us. And I understand that saying that some people are not going to like what I just said, and that's fine. The right to worship, as does anyone to worship or not to worship.
Right. Absolutely. You're kind of getting ahead on my schedule here and getting into that, but I did want to touch on one other item in the news this week that you and I have discussed was with Jay Inslee and the gas tax that were, and the reason why it's important enough to me because I'm of that class where, you know, a couple extra dollars at the gas pump a week really does affect, you know, what groceries I'm going to buy this week. And I've got 6 kids at home, 6 mouths I've got to feed, plus my wife. She eats too. And I've got a dog and a few chickens in my backyard. You know, I gotta have my fresh eggs. But you know, the price of gas right now is just killing us. It literally is. It's just really, you can equate it to bondage. You know, in a way where we're having to work so hard, and all of our hard-earned money is going just to be able to keep surviving and keep moving and traveling. And Jay Inslee has the nerve to blame someone else.
Yeah, well, I mean that's typical Jay Inslee, and I'm not going to call this out as a partisan thing. That is Jay Inslee. You know, duck and cover. He is great at that. Or as if you followed, I saw that. I think it was Andy. I don't know how to say his last name. No,
NGO, yeah. And you know.
I think it was Andy. Like followed him out of a presser yesterday or the day before, and Jay Inslee said to him, if I heard correctly, again, he posted this on Instagram or on some sort of social media, Twitter maybe. He's following him for about 4 minutes, and he's like, I just want to ask you one question. He's like, presser, you know, we had a great presser, you know, we had a great presser. And he says it repetitively. And he's like, yeah, I didn't want to ruin the flow of that. So I wanted to ask you about gas prices. You can ask me about the Seattle Kraken, the Mariners, the Seahawks, whatever you want, but not, you know, it's like, this is Jay Inslee running to, or he didn't really run, but kind of like that awkward stride quickly to his car where he doesn't have to answer a question about gas prices because to your point, he says, oh, it's the corporate greed. You know, 6.6 billion, I think is what he quoted as Chevron or one of the major manufacturers of getting. And it's like, no, that's not the issue, Jay, because I just drove from here to Central California and the highest prices at the pump, with exception of 1 or 2 places in Sacramento, you know, major metropolitan, scratching like 1 million people. I'm talking about Sacramento, not its metropolitan area. Those were about the only 2 places where the pump was higher. Had I proceeded down into the Bay Area, sure, I would have expected it. That's always like there in like Massachusetts are a couple of the highest places for gas prices. But even in my sister's small town where there's literally 1 gas station and 1 restaurant, it was cheaper than it is here.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
That's a title that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. Having spent time in California, understanding the prices down there and the way the government works, I never would have thought that we would take the title for the most expensive gas in the United States.
Well, yeah, and it's crazy because, you know, people get these cost of living wage increases, right? And even still, some of those wage increases aren't occurring, and they're not occurring on par with inflation. And there's the inflation that you see just generally in all products. Then you have these taxes that Jay Inslee or the legislature place on us that cause this like second level of inflation where a product that's necessary, I mean, I guess we could all take public transit. Maybe that's his goal. Or we could all walk, and you and I certainly could do that at less than a mile from our office. But, you know, he puts it in a position where it squeezes the middle class, the lower class. And, you know, I mean, I remember talking to folks up in Snohomish and King County, like just seeing less traffic during the pandemic. 1, because people didn't have to go on the road, but 2, because people were getting laid off and they couldn't afford to drive. Well, now we're seeing this return to work, and now they're getting squeezed. We're getting squeezed in a whole different way.
Definitely. So, you know, I made a little bit of point about being in bondage to the tax man, right? The tax man owns us. Essentially, stealing our wealth from us, stealing our property from us. You know, the ability to get that property and have wealth and to give it to our children. We did do a little bit of a scripture study today, and one of the topics was about, you know, getting out of bondage and having that freedom and liberty that God intended us to have. And we had a pretty good discussion about it. I don't know, what were some of the things that stood out to you today when we were talking?
Well, you know, I mean, again, and I'll defer. We happen to be LDS, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We were reading the Book of Mormon, and we believe that this is a promised land. You know, this was a place that was covenanted for freedom, for security, and that covenant was contingent on individuals or the collective society looking upward towards God. We also believe, you know, and this isn't a church doctrinal standpoint, but you and I have had this conversation plenty, that I'll speak for the collective we here, believe that the founders of this nation carried that kind of promise through the Constitution, that the freedom that they forced themselves into and then subsequently experienced was because they basically carried that, as we talked about Ballard, that contract with God to preserve this as a favored nation. I believe wholeheartedly that is true, that this country, you know, and I'm sure there are folks that are going to dispute it, you know, that we ravaged the natives and that sort of things. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But you look at the history of the country, that when people have been God-fearing, have been God-centered, this has been a blessed nation.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And yeah, that theme, I think, really carried through it. And maybe it's because that's what's top of mind for us, because that's the mission that we're here. We're sitting here in our office, and that's, you know, we literally have our mission up on the board that says we support, protect, and defend the Constitution. We will always focus on God and country as the core of our mission. Maybe that's, you know, that thought or that, you know, that mindset was what leading our study this morning. But it really, what it came down to, and we remember, is that ultimately it's the gospel of Jesus Christ that guides us and leads us. And I think that our topic and our discussion ended up talking a pretty good topic about grace and what grace means to us individually and you know, collectively, and how grace plays that part in our lives, right? The mission that we have, we're going to come up short time and time again, and we haven't accomplished everything that we've set out to. We've had losses in the court, we've had losses as a foundation, but we understand that ultimately what matters is that we have that grace of God. The grace of Christ is all that matters.
Yeah, and you know, we see that reflects often in the work that we do. I mean, whether it's randomly getting funding that we didn't expect so that we can carry on this work, whether it's finding other colleagues, like we've had, you know, again, we've mentioned Katie and Ryan, they're awesome at their work. We've had Karen, as anyone that's watching this has probably watched that podcast. We have Austin there too, and we, you know, you and I are blessed with supportive families, and maybe our kids don't fully get it, or really, you know, dad's going to work, but you know, supportive spouses. I mean, yeah, I mean, God's grace has filled so much space in our lives and in the foundation. It'd be hard to look past. You know, I know we talked about, you know, the parable of the worker, the one that contracts to work all day and gets the same pay as those who work less and less and less progressively. But, you know, that's the cool thing about God's grace, is that through the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made, we all can get that same reward. And tying it back to the foundation, I know that when we stepped out and made this decision to create the foundation, there was really no roadmap, there was no format. And the fact that, to your point, we're just shy of a month away from year 2 and progressively increasing. And, you know, folks ask us to couch the wins. I still look back on the single mom down in the Vancouver area who was told by the school district, we will cite you, or by the sheriff, that we will trespass you if you come back to get your kid from school. She was allowed back in school because of the work that we helped her do. when we look at the way these doctors are persecuted by the Washington Medical Commission, that's changed over time. And, you know, God willing, maybe at our hearing next week, or if it gets bumped the week after, in our Turner case, maybe we actually get a judge who sticks his or her neck out and says, hey, this is a rule and you didn't adopt it properly, so you got to go back to square one with all these doctors. Could you imagine what wave of an effect that would have? You know, we know that our federal case didn't go there. Judge Rice didn't want to hear it.
No.
And we're bringing it in-house we brought it in Benton County. There's some great judges down here. And I'm excited to see what the analysis is, because we're also attacking it on a different level. And, you know, there have been also PRA, Public Records Act requests, where we've gotten information about the inside working of the government that I think we've shared with our followers, that has both been eye-opening, but also I think hopefully beneficial in how to approach things. So, I mean, we've had some wins. And again, that's all that's because of the grace of God. That's all because of the work that we're able to do because of that grace.
Definitely. And it sure doesn't hurt to have all the prayers that we have. You know, I know sometimes that's all people can give, and sometimes that's all it takes is some prayers to send those up to God, and angels are watching over us and pushing us through. So that's great. Is there any other updates, any other cases that you wanted to let our followers know about, to keep thinking about and praying about?
You know, obviously, our House Bill 1240, that case, you know, it's still proceeding. It got moved to Thurston County. The preliminary injunction was denied, or excuse me, the motion for temporary restraining order was denied. Now we have an option to go for the motion for preliminary injunction, which we're hoping to file in the next couple weeks.
So quickly, 1240 was the so-called assault weapons ban, correct?
Correct.
So the Second Amendment case, guys.
And let me tell you a quick story where I want to kind of outline what we were just talking about, the grace. You know, over the past 2 weeks, guy that's counsel, he was the trial attorney on the Oregon Measure 114, which was their assault weapons plus permit to purchase plus 10-round magazines, like mass ballot measure that was adopted by the people. And his name's Leonard Williamson. And I had a chance to talk to him about half an hour just on my, you know, right before you and I jumped on this. And, you know, over the past 2 weeks, he's been pinging me, and he sent me all of their trial folder. Now, I've got some of these documents because we wrote our amicus brief on Oregon Measure 114, but I don't have all of those documents, and it's all literally housed in one place. And he's got all their expert depositions. And talking to him just earlier, he was like, hey, you know, one of their expert witnesses said the ban isn't going to be the fix. It's the 10-round magazines. Okay, well, that's great for a 1240 because 10-round magazines were prohibited under a different law, right? Like, so, you know, it's awesome that because we've pushed and done all the work, we get these blessings in return. And one of those happens to be building this network, and, you know, Mr. Williamson freely sharing information that over the past year or 8 months that they've brought together. And I mean, you know, I could go on, but it's stuff like that, you know. It's exciting to watch different people get involved in different ways. And to me, that is like the whole God's grace of he's looking out, taking care of us.
Definitely. So we've got a number of the Second Amendment cases that are working their way through the courts. You hit on the medical freedom with Dr. Turner, his case, and we're working on actually going in front of the Supreme Court with the Hanford case.
Yeah, that one we have up until early September to file what's called a petition or writ of certiorari, and that is just a request for review. And that has to outline where you think the court erred. And in our case, we believe that in the Hanford case, for anyone that's unfamiliar with that, because that was very early on, I think it was our second lawsuit that we filed, it was about challenging Joe Biden's 2 executive orders related to the COVID-19 shot mandate. and that was for contractors and direct employees to the government. And we challenged that on various Administrative Procedures Acts. I can think of the acronym, but I can't think of it. But financial regulations, other, First Amendment religious violations. And that First Amendment religious violation is not just protected under the First Amendment, but in the 90s, there was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which basically codified it as law. Not that the Constitution needs codification, but there's also statutory benefit, right? And so under RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, there's an open question as to whether or not the government has waived what's called sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity means it's a shield, basically a corporate liability shield. Think of it that way. And that's used specifically for the government. You can't sue me under sovereign immunity unless I waive it. So the United States is a corporation, and I hate to say that in that sense, because, I don't want to get a bunch of people's antennas up that we're going, what is that thing? You know what I'm talking about? Where people defect or whatever.
The sovereign
citizens. We're not advocating for that. I want to be abundantly clear. And if you don't like that statement, you can certainly.
No. Here in Washington, we want $30 tabs, and sovereign citizens, they're all about putting their own license plates on their car.
I know.
I think we might have some. I'm not the attorney here, but I think there's some legal standing to putting your own license plate on your car here in Washington.
But, I don't advise that.
I digress a little bit.
So anyway, sovereign immunity shields the government from being sued unless it waives it. In other words, it says, hey, you can sue me on A, B, C, D, and E. And the government has done so historically on various issues. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals states that the government, even though it says in RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that there's an opportunity for some sort of damages, that's not a clear waiver of sovereign immunity. And that's what the Ninth Circuit held its hat on in our Hanford case. It said there's no clear waiver of sovereign immunity. Therefore, the government has it until it waives it expressly. And again, RFRA's written, there is an opportunity for damages. And it's like, well, how do you get that if there's sovereign immunity is not waived? There was I'm going to backtrack to 2020. There was a case that went to the United States Supreme Court. It was a prisoner's rights issue. I think it actually, if I'm right, and I don't want to quote myself on this, it was either a 9/11 or one of the ISIS guys had a religious claim against the U.S. government as a prisoner of war, or as a prisoner. We don't have prisoners of war, sure. And so he's getting locked up. He doesn't get to pray enough, sues the government. And they, in that case, open the door to damages under RFRA. And under some of the Fifth and Sixth Circuit cases that came out of the COVID, those circuits have also opened the door to damages under RFRA and basically said that the language in RFRA for a waiver of sovereign immunity. Go back to our case in Hanford, Ninth Circuit says, no, the door is shut. There is sovereign immunity. You cannot touch the U.S. government. And so because there's both a circuit split and some kind of nuanced language from a U.S. Supreme Court case that's less than 4 years old, I think it makes the Hanford case attractive enough to the Supreme Court to actually take up the case. Well, so as we have until September 11th to do the petition for certiorari. And then the government will have its opportunity to respond, and the United States Supreme Court will decide what it wants to do with that. I think it's worth bringing that case because if we're able to really just hit that RFRA damages question on the nose, can the U.S. government be sued? Can the U.S. government be sued for violations of RFRA to provide monetary compensation, right? That's basically the question we're putting before the U.S. Supreme Court. If they believe that's worth hearing, think about all. I don't know that it'll benefit everybody under COVID, but certainly moving forward, it would make, in my opinion, the U.S. government very reluctant to do another COVID shot mandate because now you're going to have tens of millions of people who might have the door open for damages. So that's, to me, why that case is important enough to actually put the effort in. We were looking at a different case that we received a mailer on. They're claiming that their petition for certiorari, which again just gets you into the door, and whether or not the U.S. Supreme Court wants to hear it, they're trying to fundraise between $50,000 and $100,000 on that. And the claim that they have, and I think this is probably a lower ballpark area, is $500,000 if the case gets reviewed by the Supreme Court. The cool thing about that level is you're not bringing new evidence. But the briefing, I mean, there's stuff like it has to be color bound. You have to produce, I think, 20 versions, not 20 versions, but 20 copies of it. So it's just, there are day-to-day expenses of running an organization like this that could amount to $100,000 for the petition. There are day-to-day expenses plus all the extra expenses of being before the U.S. Supreme Court, the travel, again, the 20 copies, stuff like that could make that $500,000 budget the lower end of the budget. So while I'm excited about this case, one, I'm under the gun to get it pled out in less than 2 months. And that may sound like a long time, but it's going before the Supreme Court. We want that to be as perfect as possible.
Absolutely.
And then two is just the cost.
Right. Well, and I mean, just the fact that how you explain the importance of that decision, that this could be a groundbreaking case that does ensure that we don't have the government stepping all over our rights again when it comes to our bodily autonomy. I mean, these are the kinds of cases that the college students are reading about in their constitution books, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to protect our bodily autonomy. It's going to protect the government from stepping on any other religious elements, especially in the workplace. I mean, it's going to allow us to freely be who we are, and I think that's really important, going back to the whole covenant relationship between God. If we have to hide that we're Christians or our Muslim friends, anyone who's practicing worshiping God, in a way that's respectful of others, why not let them do that?
Right. Well, awesome. I think we've given a pretty good update, and we've kind of got a good check-in with our lives and what's going on here at the foundation. For those of you listening or listen later on, if you have any questions or want to know more about what we're doing, anything specific, or if you have something that you want us to look into to see if it's something that we can work on as a foundation, send us an email at info@silentmajorityfoundation.org. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. We're definitely always looking and want to hear from our followers and supporters, and want you to be part of our community. Talking about the small town, this is a small town kind of community that we're establishing here at the foundation. We want everyone to feel welcome, and that this is our fight together. This is our community. These are our families that we are fighting for.
Absolutely. And so we're happy that our supporters are part of our family. Again, people that are praying for us, people who have the ability to donate for us. God bless you all. Thank you for that continued support. It matters, when people ask about their prayers, and it's like, it really does. I mean, the burden is quite heavy, and there are times where it gets lifted. And I know that's through my prayer, through your prayer, and the collective our prayers.
For sure. Well, thanks for your time. We appreciate you listening in to our ramblings, and we hope that we were able to share something of value. And like I said, if you have any comments or want to hear anything from us,